So welcome, bel bonjour, bienvenue. We are very happy that you're joining this session with Dr. Jennifer Boittin, Trika Kitten, and Christina Ferpo this afternoon. We have a great program and fabulous presenters. For me, the book salons are always an excellent opportunity to immerse ourselves in colleagues' work and talk with inspiring scholars. So I would like to talk quickly about the format. I will concisely introduce the panelists, Dr. Trika Kitten first, Christina Firpo, and last but not least, Jennifer Boittin. I will put links in the chat for you to get more information about them if you don't know them. Then I will say a few words about Jennifer Boittin and her research. I will ask her a kind of secret question to start the festivities, and then Dr. Trika Kitten and Christina Ferpo will be doing their presentation. They will ask questions, and then I will open the virtual floor to the audience. Please do not hesitate to put question in the Q&A section anytime during the book salon. Your attendance and your questions make this book salon what it is, a space of intellectual vitality and exchange where we focus on ideas and support each other. So let me now first present our guest. And as I said at the beginning of my presentation, at one point in the chat, I will put some links and then you can learn more about them. So I would like first to introduce Christina Ferpo. She's a professor of Southeast Asian history at California Polytech State University, San Luis Obispo. She's an accomplished scholar. I'm always inviting great people. Her past books include The Uprooted Race, Children, and Imperialism in French Indochina, 1890-1980. Published by University of Hawaii Press in 2016, and Black Market Business, Selling Sex in Northern Vietnam, 1920-1945, Cornell University Press, 2020. She is currently writing a book, and I'm really looking forward to get my hand on this book when it's done, Beauty and the Nation, Race, Capitalism, and Modernity in Late Colonial Vietnam. This book explores beauty culture and gendered consumerism that developed during the height of colonial capitalism and flourished despite the privations of the Great Depression. My next panelist will be Dr. Trika Kitten. Interdisciplinary social science best describe research, writing, and courses which focus on Black, Paris, and Black France, as well as the broad intersection of racialization, racism, and identity politics in France, Western Europe, and the US. She is also an accomplished scholar who has received many accolades. Her books are You Know You're Black in France When, The Fact of Everyday Anti-Blackness, Longlisted for the American Library in Paris Book Award, 2023. Then we have Black France, History and the Politics of Blackness, co-edited with and published by University Press. If you want more information, you could go and look in the chat where I put links about Christina and Trika's achievements and publication. Last but not least, Jennifer Anne Boittin. So if you're thinking about a kind of official biographical information we find online, you will learn that Jennifer Anne Boittin is a professor of French, Francophone Studies, and History at Pennsylvania State University. Among other themes, she considers how colonial spaces such as French West Africa, French Indochina, and the French Caribbean were shaped by intersections between gender, race, migration, and urban culture. She also focuses upon how such historical questions shape contemporary France, using archives, newspapers, literature, and film. Such intersections for her shape a first book, Colonial Metropolis. If you haven't read it, you need to. The Urban Grounds for Anti-Imperialism and Feminism in Interwar Paris, published by University of Nebraska Press in 2010. She has also published a lot on the Nardal sisters, anti-imperialism, masculinities, Black and African diaspora, Josephine Baker, negative thinkers, and women travelers. So now it's my time to say something personal about Jennifer, or personal for me. I first met Jennifer in 2006, when I read an article in Black and White, Gender, Race, Relationship, and the Nardal sisters in Interwar Paris. I was blown away. And by that, I mean, I was totally jealous. This is my code for jealousy, being blown away. I just discovered the Nardal sisters, and I was from Martinique, and I didn't know about them. I couldn't believe how Jennifer could write so well and respectfully about essential issues, social, political, racial ones in Martinique. In that particular article, she explored the intricacies of a time unknown to me. What I enjoyed about reading this article was the wealth of information provided and the finesse of the writing. If there's one thing I will say about Jennifer, she's a fabulous writer. She is precise and decisive. She always looks for the right word. At the time, I was still a graduate student, and I thought, when I grow up, I want to be her. I want to be a fabulous historian. Then reading her first monograph, Colonial Metropolis, confirmed what I already knew. I really needed to grow up and write and be an historian like she is, or she was at the time. Then I met Jennifer in person in 2011 at a conference in Liverpool. I was totally fangirling her. I told her how much I love her work. I think my enthusiasm scared her a little bit because I'm always doing too much, but she was very nice and gracious during our interaction. We promised each other we would attempt to work together at one point, and this never happened until 2018. Owing to a project organized by our friend and colleague Sylviane Larcher on Afrofeminism, we are in French and Francophone context, we finally had the opportunity to work closer in co-organizing a conference. Working with Jennifer is always a pleasure. She's great to push you and to help you improve yourself. There's a lot of things I can say about her, and they're always positive, but today I want to concentrate on her rigor, ethics, and drive. As far as the book is concerned, Undesirable, she was committed to finishing it despite the pandemic and other challenges. I admire that she made many sacrifices to see this book come to life. For Jennifer, being able to share the voices of these women mattered. Each of these women, one way or another, let us know that the personal is political. They also remind us that mobility is political, whether you can move or not. All these women too, one way or another, like the communist Bao Luong that Jennifer explore and study in a book, challenge us while asking, and I quote Bao, why do we not have the right to behave as human beings? Jennifer's book, Undesirable, Passionate Mobility and Women's Defiance of French Colonial Policing, is a monumental work in a similarly skinny jacket. She did a tremendous work of archival research. She consulted 326 FIG dossiers containing 560 stories, which are the heart of the book. She manages to condense all this information into a very accessible, intelligent, and of course, well-researched narrative. This accomplishment is not an easy feat. Like the women she examined, Jennifer Boittin embodies for me passionate mobility as she traveled to various sites, Dakar, Paris, Aix-en-Provence, and Phnom Penh, to be able to find the content to write this book. Another persistent facet of Jennifer's conceptualization of undesirable is women being underestimated. Thus, I will argue that when institutions, organizations, and even individuals were far from being supportive, did not take her seriously or brush away a project, they deemed her undesirable too. And she found her own tactics to prevail. A book attests also of her pugnacity, but also of her generosity. Her 5 chapters are a mastery of condensed and rich information in a sharp and precise prose. She raises important issues about women's bodies and state surveillance and Frenchness, but also masculine fragility. All these issues, unfortunately, are still very relevant today. So here's my question for you, Jennifer. How did you encounter those women? And why was it essential for you to let the world know about their existence, what was and is still at stake?
Thank you, Jacqueline, first of all, for that extremely warm introduction. Thank you also for organizing this entire event along with your administrative assistants. I know they work tirelessly, and so I'm very appreciative of that. And thank you, of course, to Christina and Trika for joining us today. I admire all 3 of you as supportive, as feminist scholars, as really engaged scholars, and also as people with whom I have loved to work in all sorts of different ways over the years. It's rare to meet 1, let alone 3 people who have such similar qualities in their scholarship and in their everyday sort of encounters with you. And of course, I also admire your own research and work. And so there's something sort of wonderful and terrifying about this kind of a format. But I love it because instead of me just talking about my book, I get to hear what you think of it and then respond to it. And I think there's something very rich about flipping the usual book talk around in this way for this kind of situation. So I was thinking about this, actually. I was thinking that usually when you give a book talk, you're sharing a story of your book to an audience that hasn't necessarily read it. And instead, this time you're sharing your stories of my book with me, which is just really a fun way to think about the project. So how did I encounter all these women? And I think to answer that question, I have to flip back to when I first started this project, which is a long time ago, because my inspiration for it was actually the last chapter of my first book of Colonial Metropolis. And what happened in that particular chapter is that I started to explore the ways in which the partners, companions, friends, and allies of Africans and Antilleans in Paris in the 1920s and 1930s, who were white French women, were often traveling overseas in order to either reinforce their sort of connections with Africans and Antilleans, or it was the fact that they had gone overseas to colonies that inspired them to come back and join in anti-imperial politics and other kinds of politics alongside these men. And I started to realize that that time they spent overseas was probably quite important, but there at that date had still been relatively little work that had been done on French women who went to West Africa or the Caribbean. And so I really actually started the project thinking I was going to work on the sort of continuation of that particular story. And then I got into the archives, and for those of us who are historians, or I think for any sources you work with, sociologists and anthropologists encounter this as well, what I found in the archives was so much more than what I thought I was going to find. So I entered and I would sort of vaguely look for the names of the people I knew, and then I'd sort of read around them as one does and look at the thicker files around them. And I did come up and across the names of women such as Lucie Couturier or Denise Morin-Savino, who were very real critics of the colonial system and had really wrote these tombs that exposed all of its violence. But I also came across all these other names, which is something similar to what happened when I was writing my first book. And often they had shorter stories where I maybe knew the middle, but not the beginning and the end, or I knew the middle and the end, but not the beginning. And it felt at first as though, but everything I read was really interesting because I was hearing their voices and how they interacted with various administrations, or through the letters they wrote, or through depositions they gave the police and so forth. And once I had read those voices, and those were the voices of people who were in more delicate situations, or who were not necessarily literate or only partially literate, or who didn't speak French, or who, for all sorts of other reasons, didn't have that same capacity to articulate the ideas and publish their ideas in the ways that, you know, Savigno and Couturier did. I couldn't, once I encountered them, I couldn't unhear them. I had heard them and I could not unhear those voices. And I realized that the story, that was a much more important story to tell in a sense. And so my whole project shifted at that point in time, because suddenly I was still, and there still are stories of those women who had more standing and more of a platform through which to articulate their critiques of colonialism in the book as it stands. But those other voices became, in a sense, almost more important to me. And so I think that when I say how I encountered them is, I don't know if I found them, I think they may have found me, to be honest. And once they found me, then the story became, how do I respect all of those stories that they're transmitting? How do I listen to the archives, which is this kind of methodology? And it's one of the reasons that I ended up reading a lot of sociologists and anthropologists when I was doing this research, because I found myself really in following this, although I didn't do oral history, following some of the practices of oral history and of sociologists and anthropologists, and really attempting to listen and give a lot of value to the voices of women who have not been heard in some cases, at least in the written form that is often used in order to record histories of these spaces. And I also started really thinking about the orality of the archive, that you actually have a lot of oral history, even when it's been transcribed through these different ways. And so that really completely transformed the project. That's where I started to look into the notion of the undesirable, this term that came up more and more, and also where I started to think that what a lot of these women had in common, although they came from all these different spaces and places and backgrounds and trajectories, was this notion of passionate mobility, which I'm sure we'll get back into later, so I don't need to bring it up now too much. And you said, why does it still matter? I think was part of your question as well, Jacqueline. I think it still matters because a lot of the things that I saw in these archives are still very much present in the way both France and various spaces of France's former colonies are functioning today. The way that bodies are treated when they move, a lot of the same sorts of restrictions, expectations, barriers are put up around those bodies, and where that body is from is going to make it more or less difficult for it to move through space. And when we think about the ways that migration function today, and that mobility functions today, I actually was surprised by how much had not changed since the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. I really expected more of a change. And so, in fact, that's one of the reasons that the epilogue really goes almost up to the present, because I found these themes coming up again as I read, you know, the news while I was writing. And so it was really interesting, not to say that they're completely identical. I remain a historian in the sense that I think there are things that are specific to the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, that there are evolutions across that time. But to realize to what extent the issues that these women faced are issues that women and people more generally still face today. That's, I think, what makes it so relevant. It gives us background, and it also allows it to become more difficult to say that the issues that are discussed in contemporary France, for example, suddenly appeared in the late 20th century, early 21st century. So I think, did I miss anything in your question, Jacqueline?
Nope, I think that's perfect. And
Thank
I would
you.
like, thank you so much. See, it was not like too mean. So, so now I would like Trika to take the floor and to share, you know, a view about your book. Thank you so much,
Yeah.
Jennifer.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Please allow me to also begin by thanking Dr. Jacqueline Couty for that kind introduction and for, inviting me to participate in this wonderful book salon with my dear friend, Jennifer Boittin. Now, I was asked to begin by sharing briefly how I also met Jennifer, followed by discussing a theme that stood out for me that I feel renders her work both timely and essential, and conclude with a question for Jennifer, though I have two. Mine are not pièges non plus, but I've integrated them in my remarks and I'll repeat them at their conclusion. So how did I meet dear Jennifer? Well, it was 2008 when we were witnessing in the Metropole a regeneration of activity on questions pertaining to the memory of slavery, race in a race-blind France, anti-Black racism, the Black condition, and what it generally meant to be Black in a contemporary French society. The smell of change we felt was really thick in the air, and I was fortunate to convene a symposium with a dear friend and mentor of mine and Jennifer, the historian Tyler Stovall, who joined our ancestors way too soon in 2021. The historian Marcus Bruce was also a co-convener of this event entitled France Noire, Black France, the Poetics and Politics of Blackness, which assembled an array of extraordinary speakers. And just to give you a sense of the project, this included then Minister of Justice, Christiane Taubira, who delivered our keynote address, the political scientist Fred Constant, who was probably the only Black French Minister of Foreign Affairs at the time. There were diverse scholars and public figures such as Abiola Irele, Hortense Spillers, Elizabeth Boy, Mamadou Diouf, Alison Blakely, Brent Edwards, Jean-Paul Roqui, Michel Giraud, Eric Fassin, Véronique Elenon, Dominique Thomas, Alain Mabouko, Daniel Maxima, Simone Njame, Jake Lamar, Barbara Chase Rebu, Bonetta Jules Rosette, now France 24 journalist Fatima Dewan, and our dear Jennifer Boittin, among others. Now, this was a defining moment for us that occurred early in our careers and precipitated a series of questions and conversations between us on Black France and Black Paris, in which we're still engaging. And this evolved into a cherished friendship with someone whose brilliant scholarship has elucidated and complemented my own. And undesirable, passionate mobility and women's defiance of French colonial policing is definitely no exception. So I share Professor Couty's, admiration of you, Jennifer, on so many levels, and all sentiments that you expressed are returned 100-fold. Now, in that light, I'd like to focus my remarks today on a central and fundamental theme of this meticulously detailed, cutting-edge, and breathtaking study, to echo respectively Leora Auslander and Alison Copeland, the book's endorsers. And that is the theme of undesirability as lived experience. Now, I was particularly drawn to this label attached to, quote, behavior that slipped and slid around the norms of respectability, as Boittin writes, not only because of how she unpacks and illustrates this understanding through empathetic storytelling, but also because she captures precisely how the past is prologue, given the issues of policing and police violence in contemporary France today. Now, in so doing, Boittin raises a number of pertinent and timely questions about epistemological violence and asymmetries in terms of the often imperceptible ways that ideologies, knowledge, power, and their wielding result in the omissions, silences, and invisibility, and here the aggregations of women's intersectional lives that ultimately erase their individuality and the complexities submerged in the colonial archive, lived realities that Boittin beautifully excavates. Now, indeed, an unearthing, as Professor Couty vient de dire, just said, an impressive 326 thick dossiers and roughly 560 stories, Undesirable provides a critical perspective both on the tensions and commonalities among an array of women racialized as Black, mixed, and Asian in contemporary discourse, as well as white, even as they understood themselves outside those narrow frames. That is, women who strategically navigated white patriarchal supremacy and what Boittin refers to as white or colonial prestige, racialized as white Frenchness, signifying status, authority, advantage, and entitlement when exercising this passionate mobility. And one of the questions that I have for Jennifer is, I'd like for her to unpack for this audience the lived experience or reality of passionate mobility through an illustrative case in your study that best illustrates and renders legible the notion of passionate mobility. Okay, but what's undesirability, right? Or being branded as such through colonial policing? Now, this is not just an existential question in Boittin's work, even as those so identified were perceived as an existential threat. As Boittin writes, quote, throughout 20th century colonization, women posed what officials perceived as a political threat to colonial prestige because their domestic, conjugal, and parental circumstances signaled the strengths or weaknesses of the empire, end quote. And as she writes further, quote, undesirables were a political issue because as they pursued passionate mobility, they exposed issues of sexual assault and more insidious aggressions, implicit and overt racism, and the political and regulatory failures of the state around questions of mobility and morality, end quote. And as her research further shows, they were part of a broader debate about how to manage at every level, including economically, emotionally, and physically, those deemed or so deemed undesirable, whose repatriation the French state desired financially not to assume. Now, the term itself, Boittin continues, was used most often by officials to describe individuals who could potentially be persuaded or forced to move to a different geographical destination. And it also comprised those who deployed Frenchness, real and imagined or real and assumed, to evade systems of surveillance, something we can all relate to today, and thereby expose the incoherence, the cracks and the fissures in the foundations of the French Empire, and how the lives of overseas women in this context were far, far messier than previously known. Or in the more fitting terms that Boittin gives us, quote, the glorious messiness of women's bodies, the roar of their words, and the plurality of their sexualities and femininities, end quote. I love that sentence. I just love that. I want to say it again, I feel like, but I won't. And it's this glorious messiness that also would ultimately come home to roost. At the same time, some of these women use the very structures designed to manage and control them to exact both revenge and redress against people who tried to benefit from the colonial order of things, in which hierarchies of race, class, citizenship, ability, health, age, and gender clearly intersected, as Boittin again beautifully argues and shows. Now, I found the revenge aspect, I have to say, particularly fascinating. So another question that I have for you, you can pick and choose since we only have one here. I have for you, Jennifer, is to explain how did revenge operate in the quest for passionate mobility, and what were the consequences for its failures in the lives of these women? And so while not falling prey to the ruse of origins, Boittin notes nonetheless that the term undesirable in this context is often associated with World War II, when, as she explains, quote, edicts and laws referred to Jews, foreigners, homosexuals, and leftists and other political dissidents as undesirables. Yet the term undesirable has a much longer history. In, for example, the 19th century, to describe migrants traveling to or from the metropole or overseas territories, including penal colonies in French Guiana. Undesirable migrants included those who, as a result of their misbehavior, indigence, illness, or other, had to be repatriated, end quote. Now, in some ways, undesirable could be a catch-all to justify systemic police violence, indeed a catch-all that defined as it prescribed those whom imperial forces ultimately feared as a threat to white supremacy's patriarchy. because they refuse to comply with the normative expectations of gender. Though, if I'm wrong here, Jennifer, please correct me. Now, as someone who works on police violence, I was intrigued by the recurrence of ascriptive undesirability in Boittin's rich data to designate gender bodies, and how colonial policing subjected its prey to infantilizing and dehumanizing oppression to regulate and control them, control however broadly or narrowly you care to define it. Now, it's precisely here that we see how history sets the context for the present in relation to the issues of police violence today, which is where Boittin's work and mine actually intersect. Now, in short, we see the same phenomena today through the French state to explain away or justify practices of identity controls, racial profiling, and police misconduct and brutality, whose prey are designated in police databases and logs as, quote, undesirable. And this is understood as a code for race, class, presumed origins, and gender as the primary targets of the primary targets are French youth, racialized as Arab and Black, who are primarily, but not exclusively, boys and men. Now, picking up on this point, an anti-discrimination attorney in my research, whose life's mission is to end police violence in France, captured the systemic nature of the term in ways consistent with Boittin's finding. Now, enraged at the time of an interview because of this abuse, the attorney stated, quote, "The police are instructed by their superiors to clear the streets of undesirables. Okay, it's not written anywhere that undesirable means Black and Arabs, but you don't have to say it. This term does not exist in the penal code. So we have this absolutely monstrous term, monstrous of a citizen, that they consider future citizens, children, our children, as undesirable," end quote. So as I wrap up here, it's clear that Jennifer Boittin's book is on the pulse of not only the past, but also the reappearing past. As does her fascinating study demonstrate on multiple levels how undesirability was not only a weapon in the colonial state's arsenal of oppression in 1919 to 1952, but also a lived experience in constant tension with women's capacity to pursue mobility by any means necessary, including and due to a label of undesirability. So once more, my questions for you, Jennifer, would be to unpack for us again this lived experience of passionate mobility through an illustrative case that best captures or illuminates its meaning. And if you so desire, and if time allows, to explain how revenge operated in the quest for passionate mobility and the consequences for its failure for these women. And I thank you for that beautiful book. We will be teaching it for years and years.
Thank you so much, Trika. That was, wow, that was fabulous. So Jennifer, do you want to answer this now? We just have Christina's presentation and you just answer all the questions at the end.
Whatever you prefer. It's your salon.
So let's have Christina present, and then at the end you could answer all those questions, and then we'll open it to the audience.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Hi, good morning, or at least good morning in California. First, I want to say thank you so much. I can't begin to start by saying what an honor it is to be invited to talk about Dr. Boittin's work, but to be here on a virtual stage with Dr. Keaton and Dr. Coutille, I feel unworthy to be here with you guys. But I wanted to talk first, as we've all mentioned things, we want to talk first about Dr. Boittin. And, you're going to find that what I have to say about Dr. Boittin is going to be very similar to what has been said about her. And that should underscore to you the truth of what we've all what we all rave about with Dr. Boittin. Dr. Boittin and I met about 20 years ago at the Western Society for French History. I had been extremely interested in her work on race, gender, and the French Empire. From there, I think we were on a panel together. We actually went also on a trip. We rented a car and went around New Mexico together. But we then presented at a bunch of different conferences together, from Colorado to Paris to Toronto, and I'm sure I'm forgetting some other places. We eventually co-authored an article, actually tri-authored, I guess you'd say, because Emily Musil was also on this article. And every year I get a note from the librarian of my university who is like absolutely amazed at how many times this article has been downloaded. And initially my ego swells until I look at the places and universities, and sometimes it'll give me the people who downloaded it. And I realize they're all interested in Jennifer's part of the article, not mine. But I'll take the compliments from my college librarian. But anyway, Dr. Boittin is a true feminist, both in her professional and personal life. She's, you've seen it in her professional work, but personally, she's a really generous scholar. She has read the worst drafts of my work and been so kind in the way that she politely encourages me to make my work better. And she just, she shares files with me, and she's just a really good friend. And I've seen her do this with many other people, and I really would love to see more people in academia being like that. Boittin is, in her professional work, Boittin is an absolute genius in 3 ways. There's many ways, but I want to talk about 3 ways. The first thing is methodology, which I'm going to speak about later, and theory. I find that it is very rare to find these two, actually, and writing also, to find these 3 together. Typically, we see the great theoretical works oftentimes are very brilliant, but perhaps don't have the space in the articles or the book to underpin their work with the real details of the sources and whatnot. And then likewise, the people who are really into the details of the sources tend not to make these largely theoretical contributions. I struggle with that in my own work. I cannot give a theoretical, analyze the theory and give a contribution, but Dr. Boittin does both. And then she's able to do this and write in a very clear way. And in fact, not only does she write in a clear way, but she adds a lot of personality. Dr. Keaton, you and I both luxuriate in Dr. Boittin's writing. In fact, if you don't mind, I want to point out a few ways that I thought she was brilliant in her writing, and her personality comes through. And I think this is important because I've been calling on my graduate students to aim to write for that public audience, and Boittin has done that. But she talks about the glorious messiness of women's bodies. She talks about women. This is one of my favorite, was in describing women's movement, oftentimes on boats. She said they left intimate data in their wakes. This is brilliant. The very last sentence of her book honestly had me cheering as if it was a soccer game. She says, in some circumstances, are we not all potential undesirables? Which I thought was brilliant. And I could go on and on and on about, I kind of went through and I highlighted in my book my favorite lines from Boittin's writing. The brilliance in this work is that the stories reveal the limits of imperial rule, and as Boittin describes, this kind of house of cards. So let's talk about how this is done. The way she frames it, she explores the limits of state control in the colonies. Now, I should probably explain very quickly where I'm coming from. I'm actually an historian of Vietnam, so I'm coming from the very edge of the empire, and I tend to I dabble in the empire, so I'm kind of like a self-taught French historian, which is always a little bit dangerous, but Boittin has always been my French historian to kind of help me stay on the, help me make sure my metropolitan history is correct. But what I want to do is, we tend from the colonial side, we tend to look at the state as being powerful state, powerful anti-colonial movements clashing together. And what I really like is the way that Boittin's able to use these lived experiences to show how fragile the state was and how self-consciously fragile the state was. And so she's looking at how the state tried to control people in the ways that it collected their personal data. And so the state focused its attention on women, in this case, who were migrating across the empire alone. And, as Dr. Keaton mentioned, she's looking at these undesirables, which was so brilliant because, as Boittin frames, and again, I'm going to repeat some of the stuff that Dr. Keaton said, and this is because, you should look at the repetition as these points of extra brilliance in Boittin's work. Because undesirable, this is not just a term that one or two of the colonial administrators had used and Boittin had cherry-picked or anything. These are terms that have such a large history in migrations and political actors, and in the way that Jews were described, which we later, see the implications of that during World War II. But these undesirables threatened the colonial administration and colonial society. They were threatening to an administration that was trying to uphold French prestige abroad, as Stoller has shown us. It was so incredibly important to the colonial administration. And the thing is that lots of people in the colonies were being unruly. You had Cambodia's bad Frenchman from Grégoire Moulet's work. And these people, as Boittin has showed, they strained the police surveillance system. They called into question, what was French social culture? They drained administrative resources, and they strained this kind of image of colonial life and colonial greatness. And in particular, Boittin looks at these undesirable women. And I love the way she framed it, these, women who take a rest, who's probably my hero nowadays, the woman at her chaise lounge. I want to speak briefly about the methodology because I'm kind of a methodology geek. This is great. Boittin, these women made it into the news, essentially the administrative news, because not only were they a threat to the administration, but also in terms of politically and prestige, but also financial threat. Local governments didn't want to, they've got these women, they don't want these women around because the women make them look bad, but nobody wanted to pay for sending them back. And that's how these women kind of made it into the news. Not the media news, but they made it into the administrators' news. And so you have this kind of clash between local budgets and the Ministry of Colonies trying to figure out who's going to pay for them and whatnot and why. And that's where the cases are made, both from the administrator's perspective as well as from these women's perspective. So Dr. Boittin is arguing that these women practice a form of passionate mobility. And so when the women felt that the state or members of society had violated their privacy because, these administrators were engaging in gossip and they're getting into the private details of women's lives to make this economic case for a political reason that these women shouldn't be around. So these women, they were treated like minors. Their emotions were treated as irrational. Remember, this is in the day and age of Freud, where, women were deemed hysterical, where women were solved by giving them orgasms with by some psychologist doing this. I mean, this is a time when women's emotions were both dismissed as well as seen as extraordinarily concerning on a societal level. And she's looking at passionate mobility. This is kind of not only just expressing emotions well in migration, but also using these emotions. These women asserting themselves to use these emotions which were used against them, they are using as a way to manipulate the state, for better, for worse, no judgment there. And these women were conscious that they couldn't speak of lust. They couldn't speak of their bodily desires when asking to be reunited with their partners. And so this is, in the process of discovering these discussions about women's emotions and the women just kind of using their emotions, she's showing us the feelings women were just not permitted to have. So Boittin, her source work is brilliant. She lets the sources do the talking quite literally. Well, actually, metaphorically, because it's all reading. But she lets the sources do the talking. And she found these discussions about women's emotions and intimate lives. And this reflects a couple of things. I mentioned before, it kind of, as we know from the history of psychology, women's emotions were viewed as a weakness, out of control, and potentially dangerous. And it shows their intimate lives, as women of the interwar years were reduced to the function of their bodies in terms of both motherhood and sexuality. This discourse among state officials and police tended to be about these intimacies. In fact, as Boittin found in her last book, state officials weaponized these intimacies against women who worked as the political agents. And Boittin has taken this discourse around women's emotions and intimacies to ask, what did these women do with it? How did they use it? And she finds a pattern in women's argumentation. And from that pattern, the pattern kind of calls into light the limits of the empire, you know, these kind of the value of claiming Frenchness, this unapologetic adultery, and also rejection of the role as victim, or very calculated use of the role of victim. It reveals this, as Boittin calls it, the colonial house of cards, and these threats to colonialism. These women who were visible to the public were interpreted by authorities as being, you know, as being a major threat to the empire, to the nation state. And I also want to mention that these women, it's interesting because as they're presented in the archives, they kind of come across as being the so-called historians, the little people. But that's actually not true. What I found so fascinating about this is that these women whose emotions were downplayed, yet they were using these emotions at the same time. Some of these women were actually linked to incredible power within the colonies. And I'll just give you an example from the view from Indochine. Suzanne Sodez, she's in there. She is the daughter of Georges Sodez, who was an incredibly important figure in the colonies. He was the president of the École Française d'Extrême-Orient, but he wasn't just, you know, an academic. He always had the ear of the governor general. He actually made policies. He made policies and literally wrote these policies out, and then the governor general would then sign off on these policies. I'm looking at policies on Métis, but it's amazing. And so that was his daughter, yet they still weren't entirely trusting this incredibly powerful man's daughter. Yung Van Yao is in there, and his wife. Yung Van Yao, and I mean, we've heard about Camille Travet, and who was a very famous international feminist, but beyond that, these are really important people in local society in Indochine. Yung Van Yao was an incredibly important Vietnamese nationalist who was married to a French woman. Both he and his wife appeared separately in these documents that Boittin is looking at. And then, I'm sorry, I forgot the name of the woman, but she was, Dr. Boittin was studying the owner of Hôtel des Étoiles in Haiphong, which has actually, it was a dance hall that showed up in my most recent scholarship. And so that should show you that it's, you know, as a business owner of this incredibly important establishment in Haiphong, these people are, it's not that the colonial government was pushing around the kind of, as we say in Vietnamese history, this kind of dust of society. It's not that Vietnamese, I'm sorry, I'm kind of translating a Vietnamese term in my mind right now, but it's not like that these are people who are the little people of history. I mean, these are actually quite powerful people in history who are being treated in the same way as, you know, the woman who lays on a chaise, who was probably pretty wealthy, but among others. What I found really important and game-changing about Boittin's work is the way that she defines French women. And this is something that I find people have struggled with, including myself in the past, when talking about the empire and the way that women are treated in the empire. And one of the things is this definition of like what constitutes a French woman. And from our perspective in the colonized, those who study the colonized societies, we tend to look at it as well, the colonized people don't have rights, and they're colonial subjects, therefore they're not French. They're treated as not French because they don't have that rights. And that's absolutely a valid way of looking at people. But I love how Boittin takes this notion of what are French women and expands it in a very sharp way. And the way that expands, sure, I'm sorry, that's a mixed metaphor. But what I'd like to point out is, so for example, the French woman that she's presenting is not what Chivas Baron is presenting. It's not, and let me be careful to say that I'm about to call out some authors, and I don't mean it in a critical way, because these are brilliant authors who I have written raving book reviews of their work, and I still stand by those raving book reviews. But Margaret Strobel and Marie-Paul Ha, their work looks at white women. They define French women as white women. And again, I have ultimate respect for them, so this is not a critique of them. But what I really like, and I've defined French women as white women in the past also, but what I really like is how Boittin is looking at this from the state perspective, not just as who has the rights of a French woman and who can exercise these rights, but who, and this is going to echo what Dr. Keaton was saying, but who is the French government policing? Who are they attempting to control? And that is white women, Métis women, African women, Vietnamese women, Cambodian, Khmer women. These are colonial citizens to colonial subjects, to people who are moving in between citizenry and subjectry. And these are rich women, these are impoverished women, these are major colonial actors, these are women on the street who wouldn't have gotten the colonial government's attention, who are in the margins of society. These are women who are both misbehaving and unashamed, or not even misbehaving. And as she says on page 90, race is not supposed to count, but Boittin is showing how it counts. The French government is sans distinction de race. The laws, there's always that claim in a lot of their laws, which is meant you're not supposed to talk about race, but as Boittin has showed, it implicitly, race is at the heart of everything, and there is this distinction of race. And so she's looking at how women reacted to this construction of Frenchness that was anchored in race and gender. And she argues that everybody in the empire is French, even just subjects. And by just subjects, I mean from the colonial government's perspective. Sorry, I want to just make sure that I don't speak over my time. I'm going to look through my notes. One other thing that I want to call out is Chapter 5 is absolutely brilliant. This is the chapter on gossip, desire, and companionship. And I thought that the brilliance of this chapter is, again, like I said before, that Boittin is, she's really listening to the sources. And so what I mean by that is, like, all too often as historians, there's certain things that you look at in the archives as you're reading through documents that I myself have dismissed or kind of just passed by, and I know other historians must have done the same thing. And I think a lot of that is emotional talk. It's feelings, these feelings of love and lust and whatnot. And it's really important to take those discussions and discussions of gossip and things like that we might, in the past, I've actually looked at that and be like, I don't know if that's true. I can't add that in my stuff. And she's looking at it and she's saying, well, I don't know if that's true or not. But because the sources are talking about it, it's important. And I think at the heart of Boittin's methodology is this idea of saying, let's look at what they're telling us. What are these sources telling us? Even if the sources are saying this isn't important, what women are feeling, their emotions, the way they use their emotions, even if the colonial administrators are telling us this is not important, by the very fact of writing it down and including it in the archives, it is, and then analyzing what does that importance mean. And so my question for Dr. Boittin is, could you tell us a little bit more about the struggles you had in analyzing these kind of gray areas of emotions and gossip and whatnot, because I think this is the real brilliance of your work. I mean, among the many other brilliant parts of your work.
Thank you so much. Yay, we have a lot of interesting questions. Obviously, dear Dr. Boittin, now you have plenty of things to tell us. So at least you have 3 questions. And people in the audience, now is your time to go to the Q&A and add your own questions, because, you know, you being a part of this books salon is also very important. So while Dr. Boittin is answering all those questions, please think about your own contribution to this conversation, and do not hesitate to write your question in the Q&A, and then we'll be addressing them. Thank you.
Oh, well, thank you so much. That was, I said this at the beginning, but it really is extraordinary to hear one's book, the story of one's book, from other scholars, especially scholars I respect so very much. And I should add a few things. I forgot to say, Jacqueline, that the article you talked about, which was what we discussed the first time we met, actually, I wrote just as I was finishing up being a graduate student myself. So it was that first article one writes. And so it's particularly exciting that that's the one that we connected over. Trika, we've worked together a lot, it turns out, over the years, and every single time I've been struck by the same thing that struck me the very first time I met you, which was just this very both calm and fun demeanor, so that you put people at ease. It's quite a skill. Not everybody can do that. And every time we've reconnected over the years, I felt that same thing. And I think one of the regrets, that it's not really a regret, but we both were finishing a book during a pandemic, right? So we were both sort of juggling all of this stuff together. And only right at the very end, as we were both getting ready to do the final edits of our book, did we realize that although we were working on different spaces and times, we actually were overlapping in really interesting ways. And so I kind of look forward to continuing that overlap conversation in other ways, because I think there's a lot that can be done in terms of connections through time and space. Yes, Christina, I remember our New Mexico escapade and many others since then. I also remember the first time in Paris that we walked into a Vietnamese restaurant and you just started speaking fluently, and the owner almost fell out of his chair and then got so excited because you actually spoke his language. And that made the rest of the evening quite amazing. And so I think that and again, there's a theme that I've worked collaboratively with all 3 of you. And I think that what we do, especially those of us who are trying to push against sort of standards of how one does scholarship, it depends on community. It depends on reaching out and saying all sorts of different things. I need help because I can't focus on my research right now. Or do you have any ideas for sources? Or what would you suggest about this? Or are you willing to read this little bit of my work? And so I do that for other people because I think that that's an important part of who we are as scholars. That is the sort of feminist, humanist dimension of our work. And I'm not sure it makes much sense to do our work if we're not thinking about those ways of helping other people, whether it's our fellow colleagues or our students. So that's the sort of, I was just thinking about that while you were all speaking. I'll go in order. So I'll start with Trika's questions. And the first question was really that question of how to sort of take a case and unpack it, about that notion of passionate mobility. And I think because you asked me 2 questions, I'm actually going to take 2 cases. I'm gonna also sort of not quite follow the expected the way you sort of suggest I do this. And the 2 cases I'm thinking about, the reason I'm thinking of 2 is because for those who haven't yet perhaps read the book, there are 5 chapters, 5 sort of core chapters. So the first one really goes into that notion of undesirability, and we have a couple of different case studies and background on undesirability. And then the other 4 look through passionate mobility, and the first 2 focus more on mobility, so the actual movements or what the movements does to people's sense of self in that third chapter. And then the fourth and the fifth chapter look more at the passion side of things. And the fourth one that deals with all different kinds of violence, it's passion that's more in the sense of anger, which is one definition of sort of the emotion of anger and all those related things that can come up when you're thinking about violence in the world done to other people or to yourself, and how that plays out in the archives. And then the fifth one, really the one that Christina was just talking about, is thinking more about passion in the most traditional sense of, love, sex, desire, that kind of passion. And so I want to give you two different examples, and one of them actually, though, will tie into your second question of revenge. So it actually does work, because I'll be answering both your questions at the same time. So the first example I'm thinking of is the example of Defiance, who comes up in the Undesirable chapter. And before I forget, Christina, the woman whose name you forgot was Odette Gauthier, who's a métis Franco-Vietnamese woman, who's in one of the chapters, who was seen as highly problematic, and also did in fact engage with behavior that is arguably very problematic against Vietnamese women. So the reason I'm thinking of Defiance is because she had an extraordinary trajectory, and so she's a Jewish woman who leaves Eastern Europe for Strasbourg in France, she's married to a Jewish man. They clearly she says married in the Jewish way, so it's not clear if there was any sort of legal arrangement or if it was just sort of a religious arrangement. But in any case, he leaves her. She is left with a child. She puts the child in an orphanage. She moves to Paris, where she's recruited into one of the prostitution networks of the time, ends up in Tunisia, then goes back to Marseille, then goes to Corsica for a little bit, and then ends up in Southeast Asia. So she goes into French Indochina. And the reason her story was so interesting was because, first of all, she's a great example of just what kinds of distances women were covering through all different sorts of ways. So there are trains involved, there are obviously ships involved, at some point she's obviously walking. I mean, there's all these different kinds of mobility taking place. But what's really fascinating about her story is that she is motivated at first by work, so by the financial dimensions of why women move. She needs a salary. She's sending money back to her daughter early on. And then later on, she's just trying to look out for herself. But also, when she's in Marseille, she falls in love. And she falls in love with this man named Zari. And Zari is clearly part of the Corsican mafia. So there's this whole sort of mafia dimension to the story. He's the one who sends her to Corsica. And the reason he gives is that she's been working all this time under fake identity papers because she's not French. So she doesn't have French citizenship. And he says that in order to officially marry her, he's going to need her to get real papers that are sort of still going to be fakes, but that look real, that are French papers. And so she is sent to Corsica to work there. And Corsica is one of the centers of the mafias, which had connections with Southeast Asia at this point in time. And she said she's just working there as a dancer. Later on, she admits that she was also doing some sex work there. And so she gets her papers, goes back, and he says, well, great, you have your papers now, but I still need a bit more money in order to build up my cafe and my restaurant. Why don't you go to Southeast Asia? You'll work there for a couple of months, and then when you come back, we can be married. So she goes, on this 4 to 5 week long trip all the way, and then gets there and, gets a telegram from his mother saying that actually he doesn't want to be with her anymore. He's breaking up with her, and that's the end of their story. So, sort of like a text message breakup, I guess, of the early 20th century, something like that. And she's, of course, utterly furious, right? So this becomes a moment where something really interesting happens. She is there as a French citizen. She's Polish originally, so she's there as a French citizen. She marches into the police station and says, I want to be repatriated to France, and says, and I am a Polish citizen, not a French citizen. And so the man thinks she's gone a little mad, honestly. He sort of dismisses her. He's like, this doesn't make any sense. You clearly came here with French papers. You can't possibly be Polish. And so in the meantime, she's trying to get her original papers back, which were being held, which is a pretty traditional tactic to this day within the sex industry, that you will withhold a woman's clothes or her, in this case, it was her papers, until she is reimbursed. And in this case, I forgot to say this, one of the things he says in his telegram is, I would like you to reimburse the price of passage from France to Southeast Asia. So this is what really pushes her over an edge. He breaks up with her and he wants money from her. And so she manages to buy back her papers. And when she has her Polish papers, she goes back into the police station. She says, here is proof that I have Polish papers. And I'm going to give you every single name of every single person who got me the fake French papers, which is, of course, an illegal thing. And so that becomes her revenge. And so the first time I read the story, I was just like, oh, you know, she was angry and so forth. And it was only the second time that I realized that the policeman turned her away and she had to go back and insist. And she went back. She could have been repatriated with her French papers as somebody who was impoverished, as somebody who didn't have work. But she insisted upon proving her Polishness, and then gave the names of every single person in Corsica, in Marseille, and in French Indochina who had supported her. So this is one of those moments where revenge actually works in some ways in her favor. And the way how it does not work in her favor, and where it's kind of complicated, is that at this point also she became undesirable. And in fact, the word is officially used in her particular file. And she became undesirable because suddenly she also had an operation. It's not mentioned, and even if it had been, I wouldn't have discussed it because there's medical privileges for, I think it's 100 years in French archives, so you can't really go into those details for quite some time. So she couldn't work as a prostitute anymore. So she needs to get out in any case for her own sort of financial reasons. So they label her undesirable, and then they use that to fund her return. And interestingly enough, not to Poland, but to France. So she's actually shipped back to France after all of that. So in some ways for her, the revenge works. She does get her revenge, and they're being arrested. They all end up on trial. Fake papers are a really serious problem that they're trying to rein in. But on the other hand, she in some sense did lose control of where she could go. She had to go on the ship that they put her on, and she had to go when they told her to go. It's not like she could wait another few years before leaving. So that, I think, is one of the repercussions. And that's one example which both has that extraordinary breadth of mobility, but also shows how revenge could function if somebody deployed it well. The other example I'm thinking of is a very different example, which is the example of Soukena Konaré, who comes up twice in the book. And she comes up first in the 1930s in Senegal, where she's helping to protest the election of her family. She's part of a political family in a sense, and her political family is running against a different political family. And she creates an association, the Association Jeanne d'Arc, so Joan of Arc. And as a part of that particular association, she is committed to getting people out to vote. So these are the Senegalese who are in the 4 communes along the coast who are also French citizens, can vote in elections and so forth. So she's trying to get them out to vote. And she cannot vote as a woman. So she inserts herself into the political system in a very different way. And what I find so interesting about her story is that she is at some points literally handing out sticks to encourage men to go out and break the urns because they don't think that the elections are going to be fair. She has a great quote at one point where she says, and I don't want to misquote my own book, so let me pull up the beginning of the chapter in question, where she is saying that, let's see. Yes, where she says, give me your pants and you'll see how a woman conducts herself, to the men in her family who are not being brave in her mind and taking up this political question as seriously as they should. And she has other taunts like that, where she's going for the masculinity, or literally the pants of the men in her family. And so this is a different form of mobility. So her mobility is more socio-political than anything else, because through the arc of the book, we see her first trying to insert herself into politics in the only way that she can, given that she can't vote. And in the last part of the book, in the epilogue, we see her being one of the leading voices that leads to Franco-Senegalese women actually voting in 1945. And this is a vote they had to demand by taking to the streets again and organizing massive protests and so forth. And so twice in her case, she is devoted to politics to such an extent that she's leading movements and organizing. And I say, so it's partly socio-political, but it is also physically mobile in the sense that that kind of organizing involves going out into the streets, going to the marketplaces, knocking on the neighbors' doors, gathering people in apartment buildings. And there's this whole other physical mobility, even if it's constrained to Senegal and especially to the four communes, and in her case, mostly to Dakar and Gorée, and well, a little bit less with Fiscal, that comes up as much, but really those four communes. And so I think that that's another example that's really interesting, where the passions are also there, political, and there's a lot of anger, right? So the way she expresses her discontent with how men are doing their politics, the way she justifies her presence politically at their sides, and the way she continues to do so, for at least 15 years in the archives I was able to find. These are really, really interesting other ways of thinking about passionate mobility. And you see that sort of, so it's important to think about the mobility in question. There's a socioeconomic, sociocultural, sociopolitical dimension, as well as that physical transit that's going on. So I think I somehow answered both your questions at once, didn't I? Thank you, Trika. And then Christina, so you had a question which was about my struggle, so more about the approaches that one takes when analyzing the gray areas, and especially around that question of emotion. Like, what do you do with the files you read that are all about gossip and rumor? And that was one of the really interesting things. I mean, one of the things that we haven't said yet, but Trika was kind of bringing this up, and actually Christina was as well, is that, so this term undesirable, it appears formally in some of the files, and it in particular appears when it allows an administrator to potentially get reimbursed when they are forcing the return of a woman to another part of the empire. But it's also used as an officious term, and this is closer to the way that it's used, as Trika described in her one amazing quote from her book. And so the officious term is far more prevalent and difficult to pin down, because that's the sort of thing that's just as likely to appear in writing in a file as it is to be the thing that happens when, one person in the police station knocks on the door of his friend and walks into it and will say something like, "Il faut qu'on se débarrasse de cet undésirable," like, we have to get rid of this undesirable. And that's, of course, one of those things where when you see it pop up, it doesn't come out of nowhere. It's coming out of that whole conversation that's taking place among colleagues, and a lot of strategizing about, if we use this term, then we have a better chance that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Paris, or now their archives are in Nantes, but that ministry will actually be able to reimburse the passages, so we don't have to pay for it. So the reason I'm sort of fronting that is because I think that the gray zones are a lot like that. The gray zones are the moments where public rumor starts to become an actual source and is treated as such by the administration. All these documents in which people will say, public rumor states, right? In very clear terms, public rumor states this. And it is taken so seriously in one of the cases I found that a judge actually cites public rumor in order to call a woman to be at fault in her divorce proceedings, saying that public rumor knows she went to this one sort of place and was in a room with another man who was not her husband. And so the gray zone, it's interesting because, yes, there is part of you that says, well, who knows? Maybe that's true, maybe it's not true. But in a lot of the cases that I found, I still find the woman's voice. She ends up inserting her voice into that conversation around public rumor, sometimes to say, no, that never happened. In the case, for example, of this woman who's being accused of adultery, and that's a motive for making hers an at-fault divorce, the supposed lover actually calls the judge out in a duel. So she gets, it gets inserted in all these different ways, which makes you suspect that probably something was happening, but at the same time, the fact that he's going to such lengths to prove that it didn't happen is really interesting, because this is way past the age of dueling. It's really wasn't supposed to be happening anymore at this point in time. In the 1930s, that case happened. But more importantly, I think the gray zone is finding, so even if there's no truth, those rumors are affecting someone's life. They're affecting the decisions that are being made. When a policeman goes and knocks on a woman's door to ask questions about, you know, the neighbor, and has the neighbor ever done anything inappropriate, that's rumor, but it's rumor that's being used to make a decision about that woman's life and the aid she may get, or the repatriation request, or maybe the forced repatriation. And on the flip side of that, in another case, when a man goes and literally puts a police agent, a Senegalese police agent, literally puts his ear against the door to listen to whether there are any noises coming out of that room, because a neighbor complained that a woman was being too loud, meaning being too loud intimately, right? That's also something where that rumor, the neighbor said, is leading to direct repercussions. And then the most complicated thing, but the thing that I most found myself doing, I said I sort of had this practice of listening when I was in the archives. And one of the things I tried to listen to was emotion. And that can seem strange, I suppose, but the way people speak or write, or even sometimes their handwriting on the page, shifts as a result of emotion, right? So to me, it was incredibly important, because you do have two different kinds of interactions with the administration. You have sort of tactical interactions with the administration. You know, my neighbor told me that you sometimes do this for people, and it's more of a strategy based on community knowledge and so forth, versus how dare you say this about me, right? How dare you suggest that I would ever do those things? And that's where that emotion starts to come in. Or in that chapter on rumor, again, a lot of the letters that I found were being written by, in this case, French women whose partners were Vietnamese or Senegalese or Malian, et cetera, who they met either during World War I or World War II, who go back or who are forcibly demobilized back overseas, unless they were married or had children of the women already. And these women are trying to find them. And they are writing, and it's one of the first times you see this, they're writing, they can't just write about sex, so they try to be more subtle, but they write a lot about how they feel and how passionate they are about these men and how desperately they're trying to find them again. And that's a place where there's another form of very obvious emotion. And so I think that for me, those gray zones, they didn't appear necessarily when I was first in the archives, but they started to appear when I went back through my notes. And then I would go back in the cases where I could take photographs of documents, which it was not the case, for example, in Cambodia. Those are just all my notes, but it was the case in some archives in France, not all of them. And in Senegal, sometimes when I went and sometimes not. So it just depended on who was overseeing the salle on that day. But when I could go back, then I would go back through that document and try to read, and then I'd start to be able to piece together where the emotion comes out and where it doesn't. And so I think that that was part of what allowed me to work through some of those gray zones around the rumor, was the responses and reactions of women to those rumors, and how they decided to handle those situations.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. So I'm still waiting for the audience for questions, so don't be shy. But I've got one question slash, kind of comments. I want to talk about La Chaise Longue and Marie-Thérèse, because that was ridiculous. When I first read that, what do you mean someone called because a lady was just sleeping under a tree on a chaise longue? And that became a big brouhaha. And the more I thought about that, the more I was annoyed. And the more I realized that really this, for me, is a metaphor of how personal the political is. You cannot even chill under a tree anymore. But my question is really about this notion of Frenchness. What does it mean to be a French woman? Because suddenly, I think you brought up to me a different type of oppression. via responsibility politics. Like, no, you cannot just lounge. You cannot do this. So what can you do? How do you think this incident of the French lounge, lounge chairs, in fact, for me, one of the best metaphor for your whole project of Undesirable and French surveillance?
Yes, thank you. That's one of those archives where you start reading the file and then and you're laughing out loud in the archive because it seems so ridiculous. And it's easy. And I think my first reaction was just everybody's gone mad. Like, what's going on in this archive? But then I thought about it more and more. I thought, well, no, this is actually incredibly important because their reactions, these men's outraged reactions, the fact of sending police into a mangrove to sort of pull her out and say she can't lie. This is a very interesting. So the story, for anybody who hasn't read it yet, is there was this woman who's traveling for the second time, in fact, all around West Africa. So she was a woman of some means because she could afford to travel on her own. She was, but alone, and that's one of the things I get into with her story, doesn't really mean alone, because she's, at one point, there's a reference to the fact that the police are having trouble lifting an extremely heavy the suitcase of the eras, which was really like where I'm forgetting the word for it right now, but it's not a suitcase like we see them today. Anyway, one of the policemen lifted it up, and in the notes of the procès verbal says a trunk. Thank you, Christine. Thank you for the term. So he's like lifting her trunk and finds it incredibly heavy. So nothing described her as a particularly fit or strong or athletic woman. So it seems likely that somebody else had been picking up that trunk this whole time. And probably that was somebody who was African who was accompanying her, or multiple people, because she's also rowing in canoes and so forth. And so the idea, one of the things I think about through her case is, she's alone, but of course she's really never alone. Alone means that she is actually probably accompanied by one or several Africans who are helping her in her mobility. And it also means that there's always somebody watching her. And those people in this case are the various Africans she's crossing paths with. So what's interesting about her case is it was one of the cases that really allowed me to get to two things. Money was important in the sense that none of the governors of the various lieutenant governors of the various territories she was going through wanted to pay for her repatriation. But at the same time, and this was also very important, one in particular was utterly outraged that she was traveling alone. And it wasn't just about the money for him. It was about the spectacle of a white woman being alone. Now, it's not the only time that this comes up. I think actually the most interesting time it comes up in my book is when the West African students who are training to be civil servants at the École Normale Supérieure, they actually write or co-author with the director of the school, who's a white French woman. They co-author this causerie morale, this kind of moral chat around European women, and it's the title of the document is literally "The White Woman Judged by the Black Woman," and it's breaking down all of these stereotypes and ideas around what a French woman is supposed to be in the colonies, and they're making fun of them a lot. Like, there's a lot of teasing. You can see, like, it's good-natured, it's funny, and they're kind of poking and prodding, and sometimes they're admiring, but often they're critiquing. So just to give some examples, they'll say things like, "Why do we never see you with children? It's because you're afraid that your breasts are going to shrivel up after you have to breastfeed," for example. These are the kinds of things they're saying. Now, there were reasons that they didn't always have children with them, including the fact that they would often send them back to the metropole for education because it was considered safer there and so forth. But still, it kind of shows these competing visions of femininity. And it's one of those rare documents where you're seeing extremely explicit critiques of the white French version of femininity. And this, again, is by students who are being trained to know that version of femininity, because part of what they're expected to do is disseminate French culture when they go back to their villages all over West Africa as primary school teachers. Another critique that they start to play around with is the notion that these women are actually quite masculine because they hunt, because they sometimes wear pants, so they're flipping in all these different directions. And I think that a lot of that helps to inform the case of the chaise longue, where this woman just refuses to get up and does it twice, by the way. It's not just once. The other thing that was held against her was that she was eating fruit instead of eating a proper meal, right? So she's going around and picking fruit off of trees to eat, mangoes and so forth, which is a really good meal to have, but it's being sort of counted as atypical. So I think that the way that that kind of story helps me understand, or helps me for the book understand Frenchness, is that there were different kinds of ways in which Frenchness were invoked. There's the Frenchness that was assumed of white bodies, even in the case of somebody like Netefas, who was actually Polish, right? So there was this assumption that if you were white, you were French, and that's the first thing, and I think the most obvious. The second thing that's going to happen is there are all sorts of women who claim Frenchness. Some of them because they actually are French, but they don't legibly appear as such. And this is going to be the case for women, for example, who were métis, who were either, Franco-Senegalese or who were Franco-Vietnamese, but who, for whatever reason, didn't signal it immediately. Most did, but not always. And sometimes they had to sort of prove beyond their physical appearance who they were. And then there were the women who claimed Frenchness in order to win an administrative battle. And which case they might not have had the citizenship or nationality, but they might say, I'm in the French Empire, you are the people ruling me, therefore I am French in terms of the rights that you owe me. And you see that a lot when asking for aid, when asking for repatriation, but also around questions of the vote, where it comes up really pretty broadly about who should vote or not, because I talk at the end about the question of these Franco-Senegalese women who are legally French. But there's another article I've written since where I sort of also compare with what's going on elsewhere. And there were debates around West Africa about whether all of the West African women, including those who were in parts of the colonies where they were not legally French citizens, should still be allowed to vote as well. And so you see it even in the 1940s, continuing to be a debate about who counts in what way. And so this is not to say that, these Senegalese women want to be French in the French sense of the, French European bourgeois middle class sense of the term. They have their own way of being French, and they're very proud of that. And of course, there are those who just want to be independent from the French. And certainly Soukiana Konaré at various points is called anti-French by the French, which means she had some independence sort of senses to her. But what I'm really interested in is how and when women will claim it, what they do with it, when they reject it, when they say, I don't want to be French anymore. And that playing with that notion, I think, really complicates and nuances in ways that actually are important for how we talk about it today, what it means to be French and who is perceived as French, who has to prove that they're French. And that, I think, is one of the most important things that comes up, is there are people who have to prove they're French. And some of those, and that's what's so interesting about the chaise longue thing, some of those are women who are visibly white and yet have to prove that they're French because their behavior is not in line with what a French woman is supposed to be doing in the empire at that point in time. So I can probably go on and give other examples, but sort of in a nutshell, those are some of the things. I don't know, maybe you saw other things there, Jacqueline, that I'm forgetting.
No. I think that's exactly the kind of answers I wanted to have, because the first time I was like, are you kidding? I was laughing so bad. I mean, it's just because that's just ridiculous. But then I realized that's not ridiculous. That's just a sign of something. I won't go into details, but when you see all the scandal around this French soccer player who've been accused of being un frère musulman, and then the behaviors around that is this question of who is French, and then is the question, what is ridiculous or what is not, and this brings us back to this idea of fragility. So either like the fragility of the French state or the fragility of masculinity. That's just, so this is what, for me, an incident like that shows but there's a break somewhere. There's just, you have a beautiful facade and it doesn't seem to work. So beyond the laughter, as you demonstrated, there's something more important that is at play. And that's why I really like Trika's question. And I think, Christina, you have a question too? So, yes. So go for it, Christina.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, I just wanted to add, I mean, I found the story hilarious. I love the idea of a woman, taking fruit trees and taking fruit off the trees and lounging around on her chaise. But it's also such extreme privilege. I mean, the idea that, as you mentioned, Jennifer, Dr. Boittin, getting there, she had to have somebody to carry her trunk. She had to have, she had to get this, it must have been abnormal for locals to see somebody like lounging around in a chair. I know that in colonial Vietnam or even modern Vietnam, that would cause absolute whiplash amongst those who were driving by, regardless of if it was a white woman or if it was a local woman. And yet she still had that sense of privilege that she could do this. I mean, I found she's kind of my hero just because she's laying around, but at the same time, the amount of privilege that went into it that she was very conscious of, and she used and deployed in different ways, and also challenged the administration, knowing that she wasn't going to be subject to the violence that a local woman probably would have been subject to with it. So that's also what struck me. And and the locals seeing her, I don't know how things worked over there, but in Vietnam, to have a woman, a Vietnamese woman picking fruit off of a tree that was not hers in the colonial era, that's also kind of stealing. And had that tree been a public tree, then that's stealing from the government. I don't know if a local tree, she would have just been a neighbor and that would have been fine, but stealing from a potentially government claimed if it was considered public lands tree, that would have been a problem. So while the story is hilarious, there's an incredible amount of privilege in there that she is conscious of and is deploying in very cunning ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that I actually, when I tell her story and the way it relates to other stories around her, is that chapter is in fact one of the ones where I'm starting to think about the notion of undesirable. And it is all about the different layers of privilege that go into who is deported or not, is repatriated or not, and what they can get away with. And that comes up again, you brought up Gautier earlier, but what's so interesting about the Gautier case is that, so she's Franco-Vietnamese, but the women that she's dealing with are Vietnamese, and they're the ones complaining that she's oppressing them. And when you read the descriptions of what's happening, it's going on. And so the repercussions for these different people are really quite different. Although there, in some ways, the Vietnamese women have some success in getting back against her. And so I saw, Christina, sorry.
Sorry, I'm not sure what the etiquette is for how I just raised my hand. Yeah, one other thing I wanted to point out, I'm sorry, I cannot remember, and I know I should because her husband is really famous. The French woman who was married to the archaeologist at Angkor, what was her name and what was his name? But you're muted. And
you mean the archaeologist?
Sorry, it's in the back of my brain. It's going to come to me at 3 a.m. But she was, your story about her was that she enjoyed camping out and she loved to be alone with the ruins. And what I really thought was brilliant is how not only did you use the words that the women used, but you also kind of thought of the steps going there again, like who carried the trunk, the heavy suitcases, but also who set up that camp? Where'd she get her water from? Who is she with, even though she claimed to be alone? And I'm sorry, I can't remember her name. Luba. Yes, Jean Luba. That's right.
Yeah, well, I guess we just jump in. Wait,
Yeah.
are there any audience questions first? I don't want to kind of,
Nope, I think they're
Okay.
just fascinating with our discussion. So
Okay, great. Okay, well, but this, going back then to the Chase Lounge, and just your comments, Christina, I mean, it really kind of draws out, what also I found fascinating about the book, and it was, your play with concepts as well. And the idea of this kind of prestige, right? And I wanted to hear a little bit more about, how this kind of prestige operates and the ways in which you go from kind of white prestige, French prestige, colonial prestige. Are we missing something, or is it something that we're supposed to kind of grasp from those distinctions?
Yes. So I think that what's really interesting is when you read these documents, especially today, and they're using terms like French prestige and white prestige essentially interchangeably in some of them. Sometimes they distinguish, sometimes it's a document that just uses white prestige or just uses French prestige as the term. But I think that the moments when they're using white prestige is particularly interesting because one of the things, and anybody who's sort of worked in colonial archives has seen this at different points, is that there is they slip between terms a lot among administrators. So they'll start out by saying, Europeans and Africans, or Europeans and Senegalese, and then suddenly halfway through the same document it'll be white, black, métis. And so they're not, these are official documents. And so the idea is that they're not supposed to see or talk about race, and yet they are doing it repeatedly. So what I think is so important here is that those slips between white and French that you see taking place are not necessarily slips. It's because those both mean white in many of the cases that one sees. The context is important. Sometimes it means something else, but often it means the same thing. And so when somebody starts to get really outraged about what this means for white prestige in the region, the reason I think that's so important is because often, and even to this day, there is an analysis of this time period and colonialism during this time period that doesn't want to address just how explicit race still was in the 20th century in the colonies. Often people say, well, those are terms that are left over from the First Empire, from when we were talking about slavery and the system of slavery. But those words are still being used in official documents, including in documents, and I've seen this, and Christina knows those archives better than I do, but I've seen this both for Indochina and for West Africa, including breaking down populations in minute detail around their exact either, and this is the other interesting thing, sometimes it's ethnicity and sometimes it's race. So sometimes you'll see a breakdown that's going into the specific language and culture of that person. And sometimes they'll just say black and everything, noir, and everything's going to be around that. So the reason I think it's so important for us to think about that, and that I said what I said about how race wasn't supposed to count, but it was literally counted, is because that's one of those moments where if we don't understand what's happening in the early 20th century, then it becomes harder to understand what's happening today. And a lot of, in metropolitan France, overseas France for the, dom-tom and so forth, because it's too easy to erase that moment in our history and think this was the enlightened humanistic version of colonialism. And that really depended on who you were within the system. But also, and this goes back to that question of privilege for the chaise longue, absolutely, it's very privileged, but it's interesting to see that even a privileged woman is going to be essentially sequestered and taken aside and removed from the empire. And that's something I also find really interesting, so that the behavioral, even for the most privileged people, is still so incredibly important with respect to how you're treated. And then the flip side of that, which to me is incredibly important, is that the further down you are in the system and the less you can insert yourself into the discussion and the debate, right? You can't necessarily then write letters, you can't protest in the same way. If you find yourself, you won't find yourself necessarily kicked out of a territory, but you might find yourself in prison. Imprisoned, including if it's a mental health issue. And so, which is one of the things they were dangling around her, that it might be a mental health issue. So I think these are the kinds of things that allow us to distinguish and really think carefully. We all know about the hierarchy, but the hierarchy is even more subtle and refined and complex, I think, than I had initially realized, even when I first knew about the hierarchies that there are overseas.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. And I think, because I want to be mindful of people's time, I will, let the audience, ponder the issue that Trika and you, in fact, Jennifer, introduced this idea of the past that never goes away, that the past, which is always here, but also doesn't matter that the word race has been erased from French legal kind of policies or whatever, was there before, it is always here, and the kind of work you are doing is helping us, in fact, making connections that have been severed, not simply by history, but by political actions. and then with a tiny little mundane interactions showing how the political is still there, and how this idea of judgment with a word like undesirable, which is in the past, but also nowadays, shows us, a problem, a persistent problem, a persistent issue. So I would like to thank again Dr. Trika Keaton, Dr. Christina Firpo for joining us, of course, Dr. Jennifer Boittin for joining us, and everyone in the audience. And this is being recorded, and hopefully, a nice version of it will be available, and more people can access the brilliance of all my guests today. So I wish you all a very nice, relaxing weekend, because I'm sure this week was heavy for everyone. And again, thank you for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day.